So George Marshall is a founder of Climate Outreach. He has 30 years of experience at all levels of communication and advocacy, from community level protest movements to senior positions in Greenpeace and the Rainforest Foundation, to advisory roles for governments, businesses, and international agencies. He's an award-winning documentary maker and writes regularly on climate change issues, including articles for The Guardian, The New Statesman, The New Scientist, and The Ecologist. He's also the author of 2 books, Carbon Detox, which is available with Hamlin Gaia, which was published in 2007, and Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. I will very soon introduce you to George Marshall. Thank you very much for leading this training session today with us, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, John Miatio, and hello everybody. It's really exciting for me to have so many people online. This is wonderful, and one of the pleasures of doing things online is that it's so accessible for people. It's just sad for me that I'm not there in Scotland with you. I'd like you to meet each other before we do anything. So what I'd like you to do, please, is just say hello, say who you are, introduce yourselves quickly, and just very quickly go around and just say, what do you think is your greatest climate communications challenge? Hello everybody. Why is engagement important? And let's be clear from the very beginning, we're talking about engagement. This is different from communications. This is not just giving people information. Communications is a linear process. We're talking here about engagement, a listening process, a conversation with people within which they receive information and then they respond by. And part of the reason is that I think we need to take this up to another level. This isn't just about people knowing about it. People have a right to know. People have a fundamental moral and legal right to know about climate change and how it will affect their lives. And therefore, public engagement is a component of a wider climate justice, social rights conversation. We need to recognize that's a legal right. In Britain, through climate outreach and in our conversations with the national government in the UK, but also with other governments, we were in Glasgow for the COP. We were very strongly reminding them that in the Framework Convention and in the Paris Agreement, they all committed to educate and to inform their citizens, and this is really important, enable public participation in developing policy. They really haven't done that. So as community level activists, we are doing the very, very best that we can, and we're doing that because people have a right to know. That is important, and we need to be talking about it in those terms. But we also need to have a conversation with government to be saying, you need to be doing your bit, and in particular, you need to be resourcing us to do this, because we're constantly struggling after these little pockets of money and a little bit of funding here and there to do these conversations. These are not a nice to have, they are essential and fundamental, and the governments are legally obliged to support our work. That's a wider conversation maybe we can talk about later. And why? Well, first of all, because if people don't understand what's going to happen, they can't make informed decisions. They may buy houses in the wrong place. They may, I've just been in Australia. The town I used to live in Australia, in Lismore, has completely gone underwater in recent flooding, 2 meters higher than any previous record on the flooding. People who bought houses in the floodplain are now ruined. People have to be informed in order to make informed decisions. But also the truth is, if they don't, they make uninformed decisions about government and about policy. This is what happened again in Australia when people had not been engaged or involved in the decision or the understanding of why it was necessary to have a carbon price, and they rebelled, and it brought down the government. It became a heavily politicized issue. We need to build a public mandate for climate action. In other words, we cannot assume that politicians or businesses or ourselves have the permission to take action unless that permission is given, and we need to build that circumstance. And can I just say that's a very different way of thinking about engagement. A lot of us as activists, and I'm an activist my lifelong think about engagement as a way of how do we mobilize people. What I'm talking about here is how do we build a mandate for climate action such that people support action both inside and outside their own lives. And that has to involve everybody. And the key question we always face is, are we reaching everybody? Are we really diverse in our communications, or are we just talking to a little group of people amongst our supporters? I'm sure many of you are doing great work reaching wider, and I have to validate that. That is essential, absolutely essential. And the situation we're facing at the moment in, say, North America, particularly in the US, with an extreme polarization, is the result of not having invested any real effort in building a constituency across the political right. And that is what happens when you don't reach widely. So engagement is essential for policy. And if we don't have it, we're not going to do it. And 1.5 degrees is going to be very, very hard to reach, or 2 or 3 or any of them, actually. So the engagement is essential. Governments have not done it. The media have given it a low priority. COVID actually creates a new case to be made for public engagement at all levels. We can say we achieved a great deal with COVID that we can be proud of, although it's been a rocky road. The fact is that people did accept COVID measures and an extraordinary interference in their own personal freedom. They did that because they were informed, and to some degree, though I don't think enough, there was a conversation with them. But people were informed about reasons for doing things and treated as intelligent adults who would be informed and educated. And that came at a cost. I mean, this is from a Freedom of Information request back in 2020, so goodness me, this is old now. But even by that point, the Scottish government had spent nearly £6 million on engagement around COVID. I think it's fair to expect governments to spend equivalent amounts of money on climate change, to be honest, because climate change is a similar level of emergency which requires broad-based public support and engagement of this kind: Facebook, TV ads, radio ads, posters, advertising. And especially the government should be funding your work, because your work at a community level is the essential underpinning. That's the context. A little bit about climate outreach. Well, here we are. This is the team. We're growing. We keep growing. Founded in 2004. I'm the founder, and we specialize really in work. Well, we work with a very wide range of people, I should say. As you can see there, Scottish government is up there. We work with government departments, a lot of universities. We work with businesses too. And I'm proud of the fact that we also work directly on a pro bono basis with grassroots campaigns, with community groups, and with protest movements, because I think they're all important parts of generating change. We make the bridge between the research. So everything I'm going to say is, this is the research, now let's turn it into action, and that's one of our key goals. There's a lot of reports. Have a look at our website, and please sign up for our newsletter. That's really the best way of finding out what's happening. By the way, we're regularly hiring now as well. So if any of you have an interest in working in this field, please have a look and see. And there are lots of jobs coming up. I can strongly recommend it. We're a very nice place to work. So have a look on the website. I wanted to also highlight for you, because I won't talk about it later on, the visuals program we've been running. You know, communications is about language. It's also about images. And the work we've been doing on this is pioneering. And do have a look at the website, Climate Visuals. One of the key things to support your work on there is that there is an online directory of images which you can draw on in your work. So if you're looking for, you're doing a publication or a website, or you're producing a material, a leaflet, you want images, have a look on our website, because there you can find carefully curated, evidence-driven images we know are good, selected by professional photographers you can use in your work. I was thrilled when I went to when I was in Glasgow, and I was in the COP, and I went in, and the entire COP was surrounded with images taken from our website. Sadly, not with the little thing saying this is where they came from, which would have been very nice for us to show our funders. But all of the key images used by the British government presidency were taken from our website, and a lot of the materials in magazines and materials around the COP. So please, you have a look and use this, as indeed hundreds and hundreds of organizations are using it. By the way, as we continue, I will say I'm going to be sharing this slide deck as a PDF to everyone on this call. I'll be going through the organizers. So I put quite a lot of material on slides because it's a kind of note. You shouldn't do that. That's bad communications practice. But sometimes I have. But you don't have to frantically capture it. Just it will come. But I'll also be saying things which aren't on the slides. You might want to make a note of. But you will have this to refer to. Right. Next bit. Let's get some ground. Let's get some kind of ground principles for what are strong communications. Let's start by saying there's a problem with this. Right? There's a lot of problems with this, and this is how people were talking about climate change certainly 10 years ago, and to a disturbing degree still do. Be worried, be very worried. With a picture of a polar bear on an ice block. I mean, our visuals program was actually created to try and get rid of this whole polar bear thing. I think we've been quite successful with that. We have to make things relevant to people in their own lives. And we have to be aware that this kind of disaster-based negativity language about impacts far away have very little effect on attitudes. Now, that doesn't mean they don't work. They have very little effect on attitudes. That's to say, people who are concerned, stay concerned and use that to support their concern. The problem is it doesn't reach well to people who are not concerned. In fact, there's a whole category of people who just immediately put up their hands and just go, no, I'm not dealing with that. Understandably, people have a lot of stress in their lives, a lot of issues, especially now. Why on earth is anybody going to want another problem? And this is always the challenge for climate change. How do we communicate that it's urgent and serious without setting up that defense mechanism of people saying, I can't deal with it? It's an unresolved tension. I mean, we have to find a balance there somewhere. I'm just saying the reality is that if you give people overwhelmingly bleak and negative messaging and you front up with that, it doesn't work well. So let's take this as an example.
Scotland is living in a global climate emergency. If we do nothing, life-threatening rainstorms will be commonplace. Our beloved coastal towns will flood more frequently. Our wildlife will suffer. Already we've lost nearly 25%. But there is hope. If we do net zero emissions, we can play our part to help protect what we love. We can grow our economy and build thriving communities. We can do nothing, or we can do net zero. What will you choose? Find out what we all can do at netzeronation.scot.
I will be blunt, and it'd be very interesting to know if anybody from the Scottish government on this call. I wish you guys had asked for our advice before commissioning that. And not just ours, but actually, to be honest, anybody working in the field of climate communications. That is not good communications. If you had started with the message of talking about the things, we'll come back to this point, but you'd started with a message of talking about the things we love, why these are important, how we're going to protect them, because they are under threat of climate change. In other words, if it had been pitched the other way around, this is the opportunity for taking action, this is why it's important, and if we don't, this is what might happen. That might be a stronger message. But leading on this, I'm afraid you've got a whole lot of people just blanking out on that. And we know that it's very, very strongly tested. So let's keep moving on. By the way, you will get a chance to talk to each other in a bit. Right, here we are. We have a problem of what's called psychological distancing, you see. People try and distance themselves from the problem. This is a research by Yale University. Yeah, we could absolutely replicate it for Scotland, by the way. When you ask people who do you think will be harmed by global warming, look at that bottom dark blue category. Every single category of distance, people think it's more likely someone else will be harmed by it. In other words, people seriously think that other people will be more affected by climate change than them, including other people in their family, it seems. people in other countries, developing countries, future generations, that's always been the big danger, pushing the thing into the future, and other species. And the problem with this is that there's some truth in it, but it's a distancing strategy. That for a very long time, but certainly for the last 30 years, we've been working on climate change. People have said, this is a problem for the future. I'm not dealing with it now. Other people will be affected. That is still powerful. So we have to make climate change here and now and relevant to people. And it's a golden rule. You know, we've had to repeat it endlessly to communicators. Do not talk about climate change as a problem for 2100 for Bangladesh, unless you are speaking to people who have a strong connection with Bangladesh. And even then, talk about the issues now. If we're talking Scotland, talk about what is happening now. Facts and figures we have to be careful with. I don't expect that you guys need to be told this, but scientists most definitely do. Facts and figures don't work well. First of all, because actually 20, sometimes maybe 30% of people are functionally innumerate. We just don't think in terms of figures. So if you say to people 20%, 30%, 40%, that doesn't mean anything to them. I'm going to show you an example of that later on. But also, I'm saying here, facts and figures don't shift views. It's the same problem that we had with bad news. They tend to reinforce views. In other words, if you give people data and they understand the data, they tend to absorb it into what they already thought. People don't operate through facts and figures. They operate through stories. Now, science is very important. We're not denying that. It underpins all of our work on climate change. But what we need is the stories, because people take a story and then they absorb the facts and the figures to fit. And if they don't like what the scientists are saying, they go and find some other facts and figures. And we have seen that again and again. And in my work, and I'm sure you've encountered it too, we regularly come across people who are very well educated, sometimes scientifically educated people who still deny that climate change is a problem. Fewer now, but they're still there. And that's because they have a story they like, and they're going to damn well find the facts and figures that fit, as people do the whole time. The Brexit battle bus is a classic case. The story, let's take back control. The European Union is taking our money we should be spending on ourselves. That's the story. And here is a fact. 350 million is sent to the EU each week that could be funding our health service. It's not actually a true fact. In fact, I think it's fair to say it's a lie. But it's a figure, and one which incidentally recent research done a few weeks ago shows that the majority of people in Britain remember. They don't remember the figure, they do remember the figure, but it's the story that they remember. So let's be clear about that. We need stories. Let's also be clear that when we're talking to people, people define themselves not just by who they are, but who they are not. That means if we get the wrong story for a group, people react against it. They say, I'm not that person, and they go and find another story. So again and again, we have to be finding the language which fits the audience we're speaking to, the story that they want to hear. And let's talk about motivation. Shared values, and I like this phrase, the joy of belonging. It's being a part of something, but joy. And I think this is something in the climate movement we need to be very, very alert to. We have to make people feel that the joy of being a part of what we are, even though it's hard and it's difficult and it can be depressing and stressful and frustrating, but it's a joyful sense of belonging to who we are. Because in the end, that's what motivates people. And in the end, that's what builds social movements, is the joy of belonging. And when we communicate with people, we have to be very careful. I mean, many of us are carrying a heavy burden of this issue. We've got to be very careful we don't go to people with such a sense of being overwhelmed by the issue we're working on that they look at this and they go, well, I don't know what club you're in, but I don't want to belong to that club. It doesn't look like a joyful place to be. And I think we do that sometimes. Shared values and the joy of belonging. Look at how powerful the experience was of Clap for Carers in during COVID. And similarly, all mass outpourings which are about a feeling of support, of being a part of something. We've seen some major shifts during COVID of people's sense of belonging. So here's a little bit of science for you. We said this for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We wrote a whole report for them on how to communicate climate change. And this is very strongly supported by the evidence. Climate change, understood and believed. I think we can say believed. We need to be careful with the word belief. But I have a chapter in my book about the strengths and weaknesses of talking about belief. I think climate change is something you hold as a core value, and therefore as a kind of belief. Is a socially constructed narrative, right? Socially constructed, so shaped by the exchange between people, conveyed by trusted communicators, and it's a narrative that reflects identity and values. And this is the essence of what we're going to talk about today. How do we create that narrative and reflecting identity and values? So this in a way is the template. This is the magic page. So if there's anything I wanted to take away from this workshop, it's probably this. This is what good communications has to do. It has to validate who people are. It has to reflect that, saying this is who you are, and it has to validate it. It has to say, and you're important, you're worthwhile, your contribution matters. And by the way, that immediately rules out a lot of climate change communications that doesn't recognize people, doesn't respect them, and often disenfranchises them, right? This is who you are, you're important. This is what you care about, and it has to reflect what people care about. And that may very well not be environment, so we need to come back to that. We need to recognize and respect the fact that, especially if we're going to reach outside these easy to reach environmentally concerned groups, which is essential for building that mandate, but people care about other things. So we have to find a meeting point. And we have to say, by the way, what you care about is important and you're right to care about it. We do not dismiss other people's concerns. We don't say, you think that's important? You should look at this thing over here. This is way more important than your thing, right? We don't do that. We show them other people within their social group also care about this thing. That is very important. Because the reason that people want to take action on climate change is not to stop climate change. We mustn't have communications that say take action on climate change to stop climate change, because that messaging only works to the people who care about climate change. What we need to be doing is we need to say take action on climate change because that's who you are. These things you care about, your values are important. Climate change affects those. Doing this makes you who you are and makes the world more the way you would like it to be, in a positive way as well as negative. So it helps to deal with your concerns, which are real concerns, and it makes the world the way you want it to be in a better and improved way. And therefore, when we're talking to any audience, and in climate outreach, we do a lot of focus group work with people, we usually start by spending a lot of time, sometimes like a third of our session, not talking about climate change, asking them about who they are, what they care about, what their values are, how they would like the world to be. And then we find a meeting point with that and climate change. That is really important. That is the process. It is not climate change. Here's this big thing. Now, how are we going to throw this at people? It's this is who we are, what do they care about, and how do we then create a way that they engage with climate change where they feel it's their thing. Now, I'm not going to make the point now, but we have done quite a lot of work with people of faith. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but say for people of faith, the way we would construct that is, well, first of all, we reflect their faith from the very, very beginning and how central it is to their lives. And the reason that they might want to take action on climate change is because it's in their holy scriptures or in their writings. When they do this, they become closer to God, and the world becomes a holier place within which they are acting out their faith through their actions. That is a very different message to the one that we might use for student anarchists or for business leaders, because in every case, it's about their own identity and their own values. I hope you're with me here. So let's have an example, and then I'd like you. I think I'd like you to have a look at this as an example of communications. I'd like you to think on the basis of everything I've said so far. Is this good or bad communications, or a bit of both, or what might be better or what might be worse? This is an interesting one because we actually it's been tested. It's been tested quite well, so we know, we have some sense of whether it works or not. So bear in mind some of the ground rules we've already laid down. It's called bedtime stories. It was the last time that the UK government as a whole, I know that the individual nations such as Scotland have also done something, and I'll reflect some of that later. But the last time that the UK government nationally did a public engagement advert. I don't think adverts are very good. I'm going to show them a number of times in this presentation because it's a nice thing to show a video. It gives us something to talk about. I'm going to keep repeating that actually the best communication happens peer-to-peer, probably in a conversation in the pub. But we're going to use these as examples because they're trying to reach whole societies, right? So the message of this is saying, well, climate change will affect your children. The messenger, well, it's an actor and a voiceover and an advertising agency, right? So we've got that. The medium, well, this went out halfway through Coronation Street. So it was TV. And the action it's asking for people to do is to go to the website. Okay. And what I'd like you to do when you're looking at this is think, well, what do you think of this? Does it work? Does it work for you personally? Does it work for the intended audiences, which remember is the entire British public, particularly for ones who might be watching Coronation Street? How do you think it went down? We know how it went down, so I'm just wondering how you think it went down. What do you think? How does it reflect these kinds of ground-based principles we've been talking about, and how maybe could it be improved? I can't control the volume of the video. I think it's okay, but you might want to make it a little louder as it plays. Okay, we all ready? I'm just going to leave that for those questions for you now. But when you go into your groups, just have a general discussion. What do you think? Well, good, not good? I'm interested in that difference between does it work for you or does it work for the intended audiences? Because that's a very important question that I'll come back to. They're not the same thing, right? Okay, let's have a look at this. So imagine you're sitting down now. You're sitting down. You've got a TV dinner or like a plate on your lap or a cup of tea, or you're sitting with the family. There might be a range of different people in the room. There might be younger people, older people. You're sitting down, Coronation Street, halfway through. This comes on.
There was once a land where the weather was very, very strange. There were awful heat waves in some parts, and in others terrible storms and floods. Scientists said it was being caused by too much CO2, which went up into the sky when the grown-ups used energy. They said the CO2 was getting dangerous. Its effects were happening faster than they'd thought. Some places could even disappear under the sea, and it was the children of the land who'd have to live with the horrible consequences. The grown-ups realized they had to do something. They discovered that over 40% of the CO2 was coming from ordinary everyday things like keeping houses warm and driving cars, which meant if they made less CO2, maybe they could save the land for the children.
Is there a happy ending?
It's up to us how the story ends. See what you can do. Search online for ACT on CO2.
Okay. Hi, hello everybody. I hope you had a nice conversation. So, I've had this conversation many times with people, and I think what's always interesting and why I differentiated between does it work for you or does it work for the intended audiences is that very often with climate advocates, they say, yeah, I like that. That works for me. And I always say to them, that actually is a real warning sign. You and we, as passionate climate advocates, need to be very, very wary of communications that we like. That doesn't mean that good communications be something we hate, but it means we need to be very careful. Our own judgment is not reliable because we are deeply embedded in the issue we work on. The fact is, it was a disaster. It was tested. It was an absolute disaster. It had more complaints than, at the time, any previous advert to be advertising standards authority. Got shown once and then got pulled. And it clearly completely failed to engage with people's values. But actually, more than that, it got a very strong anti-reaction, that people found the use of the child very problematic. They thought it was exploitative. In focus groups, when I show it to people, they say, what kind of parent reads their children stories like that? It was almost like a form of child abuse. And you can imagine, remember, if you don't care about climate change very much, scaring the wits out of your kids on an environmental issue seems like a cult. But also it breaks all of the key principles of what we're talking about. It doesn't reflect people's values. It gives a negative message. It doesn't give people personal validation. It has, by the way, some class content, which I find absolutely exasperating. Like, it's clearly a middle-class family. It's really an affluent family. So immediately we're cutting out a whole lot of people. Even I'd say that the sociology of reading your children bedtime stories is a complex one. It says things like 40% of the CO2, and that is meaningless. I mean, unless you are really comfortable with science and you did well at it, you wouldn't even remember what CO2 was. As I said, 40% doesn't make sense unless you are numerate, and even then doesn't work very well. I have to say, I think it's a very good example of what goes wrong. And the final point is, process-wise, it was not tested until it went out. And I would flag up to you, test, test, test. If you're doing communications, especially if you're producing formal communications like social media posting, leaflets and so on, show them to people before you put them out. And you might want to have like a little, a little cluster of trusted testers, not people like you. I always used to show my leaflets to my auntie Elsie, who was not like me at all. She was working class conservative, and I'd show her things and she'd say, I hate it, I don't understand this. I'd go, great, thanks Elsie, that's perfect. Because you need that. You need people who can give you honest, blunt feedback, right? And what actually happened with that advert was they ran out of time. They didn't have time to test it, but they showed it to each other in the office. The person who designed it told me this. I ran into it at a conference, and they all agreed it was rather good. Do not test things within your own peer group. There's a lot of lessons in this, right? But the biggest disasters in climate communications, the problem is most climate communications aren't good, but occasionally they're disastrous, and the biggest disasters are always because they haven't been tested. So do it properly. How could it be improved? Well, it'd be interesting to know what you said in your groups. My view is how it could be improved would be actually by having real people simply speaking about what they care about. And I'll come back to that point a little later. I should also say, by the way, that using children is tricky. Again, as passionate climate advocates, we like to think, hey, talk about responsibility to children, care for children. But I'm warning you, it's a bit of a minefield. And as that advert showed, statistically, the surveys always show that people who have children care about climate change somewhat less than equivalent people who are the same as them in every way, but who do not have children. There's nothing inherently about having kids that makes you care more about climate change. What it means is if you care about climate change and you have kids, you care very much about climate change and your kids. Just be wary of that, because those of us who are climate advocates who have children believe that's some kind of universal law, and it's not. If you don't care much about climate change, you don't care much about climate change and children. But there's a danger with it. But if you start saying to people, care about children, and they're not completely on board, they feel judged and manipulated. By the way, if we say we need to care for future generations, we're doing that thing of distancing and putting climate change in the future. So there's a lot of things. I'm not saying don't use children. I'm recommending do it from the point of view of, say, having a parent. There's a great group, by the way, called Parents for Climate Change, Parents for Climate Action, where parents say, I care about my child and I care about climate change. That works because it's authentic and coming from people, but don't judge people on it. I hope I'm not going too fast for you. That's always the danger of this. I want to make that point about trusted messengers. That is so important, and I started raising that. Narratives which validate values and identity from trusted messengers. Over the years of doing this, I've been doing this a while now, I keep thinking that the messenger is more important than the message. And that many of you, I'm sure, are doing your own communications, and some of you may very well be training communicators or training messengers, and I want to completely support that. It's actually, in the end, people's views on climate change are shaped by whether they trust the person telling them. And generally speaking, the people they most trust are the people who are like themselves, or within whom they can see a reflection of who they are. Now, generally, it's not a universal, because some people are simply trustworthy. They have an authenticity and a straightforwardness to make them trustworthy. They may be different, and actually that might make them trustworthy too. Sometimes you can be very moved by people who are different and give you a different insight. So it's not a universal rule, but generally speaking, people take their cues for what they should believe or not believe from the people around them and the people who are like them. That's why having a middle class people speaking to working class audiences, having a white person speaking to people of color, having somebody from taking me into the Gorbals and having me lecturing people on climate change, all of these are a very bad idea, right? Trust is also really important in terms of our discussion about who is communicating climate change. So this is Ipsos Mori of the UK on trust levels. It's a few years old, but it's still consistent. And we have a problem that many of the key people communicating climate change are on the wrong side of the line. The majority of communicators on climate change, the places where people are hearing it, are from politicians, journalists and media, and environmental activists. And to some degree, environmental activists are trusted. But we need to be very careful of this. Politicians are not well trusted. And this is an issue. So we have to speak better. You'll notice on the left-hand side, and this is an important cue for us for conversations, health professionals are very highly trusted, and they are potentially a key way to talk to people about climate change. Teachers, scientists, and so on, weather forecasters, incidentally. Now, this is a graph which isn't talking about climate change, it's just saying, who do you trust, right? Here's a piece of research, again, a few years old, but still, I think still as strongly if we did it tomorrow. Who do you trust to tell you about climate change? And you'll notice scientists are high, environmentalists quite good. The blue bar is trust and the red bar is distrust. So we've got to be wary of situations where there's a distrust. That's a counter reaction, right? But you'll notice friends and family score very highly on that. And in some research, people are more likely to trust friends and family than scientists. So friends and family, very, very important. Look at politicians, way down the bottom. The level of distrust against trust is so high. So that's why we say to governments, you have to invest more in communications, but you can't do it. You have to ask somebody else to do it. Now, this is actually a little different in Scotland. The research shows that the level of trust in the Scottish government is very high indeed. And I think that does give an opportunity in Scotland to have a different kind of conversation, to have one within which the government is in a conversation with the citizens. What I don't know, and you would know much better than me, is whether that trust extends to politicians. I suspect not, because politicians inevitably have their own followers and their own haters. But I think it means the government can be trusted. So that's good. It doesn't get away from the fact that the government needs to nonetheless be supporting other people to do the communications. And people's behaviors are also strongly influenced by the people around them. This is a phenomenon that we've seen across the country, where solar panels got set up in blocks. You could see it if you take the train across the country, and you'll notice that you'll get a cluster of solar panels, which is the clear evidence of the peer effect, where people alongside each other get solar panels. So people's behaviors, this really tricky thing, how do we reach people to reduce the amount of meat that they eat, say, or to travel less, or to turn down their heating? The absolute key to this is peer-to-peer. Therefore, the communications challenge for us is not so much what's for message or what's for narrative, it's what's the process by which we enable and empower people to have that conversation. One of the ways, I'll come to this point in a second, sorry. We need to be wary, by the way, that people distrust environmentalists. Not all of them. I mean, there's plenty of people who love environmentalists. I do. I am one. But actually, some of these harder to reach people don't like environmentalists much. That means we need to be careful with this environmental language. Save the Planet seems to have come back into circulation when I had hoped it was dead and gone. Do not assume just because language appears the whole way through the media or is in current buzz that it works. I'm deeply distrustful about whether Save the Planet works. I think it's distancing and eco. But it's kind of like green, eco, save, stop, defend. This kind of language is very green. Green communicators who look and smell environmentalists are tricky. And I think those of us who are environmentalists, and I'm one, we need to recognize that sometimes we need to step back and allow the space for others to speak. And this is a fundamental principle of all forms of diversity. How do we enable a greater diversity of people to participate? Well, occasionally, well, not occasionally, actually quite often, what we need to do is shut up and allow the space for other people. I like the idea of saying we need to shut up when I don't seem to stop talking. And there have been some very good communications programs which have been run by using authentic voices. I've long liked this one by the government in Wisconsin, which just had ordinary people there talking about climate change in their own words to camera. I think this is a great way of communicating, and I would strongly recommend this to you. There's been of just thinking how, if we do social media, if we use video, by the way, video is fantastic, for climate change, getting people who are not the usual suspects, people are unusual people speaking to the camera about what is important to them and why works. And I might say that is the antidote to that appalling government advert would have been to have had that. Here, for example, I'm excited because I've just been in Australia. Yes, I know it's a long flight and a lot of carbon, but I also think it's kind of we're really working hard there to try and build a program. There's an outfit there called Farmers for Climate Action, and they've been doing a whole string of things. Now, this is an interesting one. This is a TV advert that they ran against the Adani coal mine, so it's an anti-coal mining advert, right? But look at the messaging on it.
I'm a third-generation grazier from out near Longreach. Out here, nothing is more precious than groundwater. So I can't for the life of me understand why the Premier gave Adani an unlimited licence to groundwater for 60 years for free. Don't let our politicians sell out our family properties. Add your name here to protect our precious groundwater.
Authorised by Angus Emmett, Farmers for Climate Action.
You see what I mean? It doesn't talk about climate change, it talks about groundwater. And it's a third generation grazier, right? It's like a big Aussie bloke. That is not who we expect as a climate change communicator. And I think there's I want to see a lot more of that. I get excited when I see people who are not who you would think talking about climate change. And remember, he's talking, I mean, if we take that template, this is who I am. You can see I'm like you. This is what I'm concerned about, water. And what's also interesting with this is it's pressing this button, which is very important, about fairness. This is not fair. Fairness is an important one. It means, for example, in terms of the transition to renewables, the fairness of the massive windfall profits being taken by oil and gas companies is a much more motivating factor for many people than the issue of climate change itself. And I think we need to recognize that fairness is one of these tipping issues. Conversely, though, if people feel that climate action is falling on them unfairly, they will resist it, whether or not, because the fairness for them becomes a bigger issue than climate change itself. Wanted to share for you, this is an example of communications which has been run now by the Climate Coalition, the nationwide. There is a Climate Coalition in Scotland, of course, and a Climate Coalition in Wales. But this is the coalition of groups who are working on climate change, and Climate Outreach worked with them, I think 8 years ago now, on a program in which they had a number of ideas they wanted to run, and we said, right, well, first off, let's not run with the ones you like. Let's go and test a range and see what happens. And we helped the Climate Coalition to test some of their ideas, and this was one of them. And we insisted that they tested it with the groups they don't normally ever talk to, which included amongst them trades unions and conservatives. That was really important. And what came out was that the ideas they really liked didn't work very well, but this one did, for the love of, in which people in their own words explain what is important to them, why they love it, and why it might be affected by climate change. Do you see, from the beginning, we're starting with people's values, their identity, what they care about. It's positive, because even though we're talking about impacts, we're talking about love. So the central theme is a positive, pro-human, joy of belonging theme. And this was one of the first adverts they did, which in my view is still the best.
The complete stress relief of coming down here, having nothing else to think about apart from digging in the mud and listening to birds sing and being out in the open.
I knew when I was growing up there wasn't much for us to do, and to help kids enjoy themselves, it was a good feeling. You see their faces light up when they're having fun. You see them when they realise something, their face lights up.
And sitting in the car with the windows open and with the whole summer ahead of you, that's a brilliant feeling.
It's definitely a passion for me. Just generally being anywhere with a rod and a reel and some water, to be perfectly honest with you. I couldn't say there was anything I particularly like more than just being by a river.
Dark chocolate, milk chocolate and white chocolate. Kit Kats, Milky Way. Yeah, and the pink Smarties.
Most tourists that get in here, they just love London. They love the old building, the history here. So that's I like picking people up, and people who come here and love the place as well.
When you're a grandparent, then you've been through it all. You can just spoil them like mad and then give them back to the mums and dads.
At this point, the advert goes on and starts to talk about the impacts. And I would like to have seen the participants talk about that, and they don't. They go to the science then, which I feel is a weakness. But that, for me, is what good communication starts to look like. A truly diverse range of voices, not obvious environmentalists, talking about children in the context of personal love and connection in that way. A broad range of class voices as well, because the environmental movement in particular suffers from a very narrow demographic of ethnicity, of background, and I think especially of class. And I think we have to have a wider range of people speaking. And when I'm asked to review the materials of environmental organizations, the comment I repeatedly come back to is I say, all of the people who are representing your organization are middle class, and this is not helping us. So again, I have no idea what you're doing. I'm sure you're all doing great work. I'm just saying, I'm just flagging up, be alert to that. So, so a couple more points on this. The first point is that we need to engender and enable and support people to have public conversation, have conversations about climate change. For a long time, there's been a phenomenon which to some degree has been studied called climate silence, whereby people actually find it very hard to talk about the issue, and that if you try to raise it, they close the subject down. And though it's not as strong as it was, it's still there. And I'm sure that all of you on the call have at some time or another experienced like trying to talk about climate change to people and they just immediately change the conversation or say something different. And many people don't even try. They think it's a tricky issue, or they know that there's a range of views on it, or it's depressing. I think we have to encourage people to talk about it, and we have to, yeah, we need to actively encourage people to have those community conversations. Climate Outreach has written a handbook on this, and please do have a look at that. And it's drawn on our work over many years. And we've got a nice little acronym, Real Talk, which is to try and help people to do this. It's really based on respect. I think we need people to really enjoy it. I think people need to see having the climate conversation as an essential part of their change making and their activism, how you make change. I would really like to see talking about climate change consistently listed in those things you can do about climate change. Because actually, in reality, talking to people around you about climate change is more important than than turning down your thermostat or reusing your bags and things. Those things we often ask people to do, because it's the way that social change happens, and we haven't had enough of that. So anyway, we have some guidance on that, and we have a handbook on it. Please do use it. And as part of that, we encourage people, tell your story. People talk about their own experience. This is something I'd say to all of you as climate communicators. Talk about your own journey. Talk about where you've come from, why you have a connection with people you're talking with, how you came from where you were to where you are now. And I'm especially, when in that last conversation, who would be good communicators, I would say a good communicator might be an older man who's worked all his life in the oil industry, who didn't used to believe in climate change and now thinks it's a major problem, because that is a key demographic we need to pin down, and we need people from that group to be telling that story. And I had somebody like that once, who's going off, and I trained him up, and he gave talks all around the country, and it was very, very powerful. So we need to be thinking, how do we get people who are not the usual suspects? We wrote, by the way, a whole program for Greener Scotland with help with Climate Exchange on having community level conversations. And I would just like to steer you towards the report. There's a link there, and of course you'll be getting the PDF, but you can simply find it on our website, in which we created a structure whereby you could have a community level conversation about climate change. You can bring people together and talk about it. And you'll see, like a lot of our process is about people talking about themselves, what they care about, what's important to them. So there's different levels of conversation. There's a conversation which is the informal one, the one you have with your friends and your family. There's the one which can be sometimes of strangers. I very often talk to several strangers a week about climate change. I just start talking about it. And then there's more structured ones where within a community context, you say, let's talk about climate change. Let's have a conversation. And that's what this guide is for. So please do have a look at that. Now I'm going to push on a little bit, and we're going to now move more specifically towards Scotland. And how do we speak to different audiences? So we're going to push ahead a little while now, and when I feel that we've had enough, we're going to go into the break. People know that climate change is happening. They know the weather is changing. And most people say that they're concerned, but the level of concern and awareness is shallow. So when we ask people, are you concerned about climate change? 2/3, 3/4 of people in Scotland say that they are concerned or very concerned, apparently. And they appear to be saying the right things. That has increased over time, which is definitely a positive sign. But please do not be fooled by that into thinking that climate change is a major concern for large numbers of people. If you ask people the right questions, this is always the danger of social research. If you ask people questions, you can get the answers you want. If you ask people, are you concerned about climate change, you will find that people will say yes. That is not the same as really being actively concerned. The big change over time has been twofold. One has been that if you ask people, what are you concerned about, or what do you think of the concerns, without giving them a prompt, climate change is now much stronger. Although interestingly, it's often much stronger to say, what are the problems facing the future or facing Scotland, not what are the problems facing you. So people have not made climate change into their own issue. As I said, people tend to distance, right? This is the second big change, is that now vastly more than was happening 10 or certainly 20 years ago, people are saying that they think climate change is here and happening now. That is a big change. So you'll see a big number, and that means that climate change is now much more current. So it is here, it is now, so we can talk about it being here and now confidently. But is the problem, if we say what are the key components for what constitutes an understanding of climate change, you'll find that it's low. It is entirely caused by human activity, and yet across the UK as a whole, between 4 and 17% of people believe that. And a significant number of people feel it's not caused by humans at all. But people need to accept it is us who's causing it, and they're not there yet. I will be directly affected by flooding, right? In the brackets here, when it says S, that's from Scottish figures, right? Well, only 6% thinks they will be directly affected by flooding. That is not true. That is far less than the levels of flooding. So people are underestimating it. The vast majority of scientists agree. Scarcely more than a third of people across the UK agree with that. That is utterly wrong. They completely fail to understand the level of scientific support for this. And similarly, in Scotland, 42% of people think climate change will have little or no impact on my life. They are wrong. So they are distancing. They're saying that is a problem. Yes, it's happening, but it won't affect me, but it will affect other people, but not me. It's doing that thing I showed earlier. And this is more worrying. So those are the people who have a shallow understanding. Now, these are the people who are not involved at all and actively resistant. Yeah, I think the impact of climate change is exaggerated, right? You'll find here, you'll find here over a quarter of men and over a quarter of people generally over 55. These are the two. This is one of the key areas where we have demographic issues. Men are far less involved than women, and older people far, far less than younger people. And once we get, the older we get, the harder it gets to reach people. People over 55, well, that includes me. That is worrying that they are not involved. Yeah. Now, it is not safe for us to simply say, oh, that's 27%, but that means that we've got 73%. Because that 27% is important. That 27% of people, they probably vote, and they will actively resist wind farms or climate change legislation or carbon pricing. So we need to make sure we have to reach everybody for that broad-based mandate. Yeah, and you'll notice over 75, it becomes significant. Yeah. Similarly, at people who are poorer, who have lower incomes or lower education levels, are resistant, and that is very often because they have a lot of other concerns. And again, we have to find a way for them of engaging climate change for their real concerns. Similarly, here, the level of pessimism about not reaching net zero targets is quite significant. That's a funnier question because I don't know what I would answer if I was asked it. I'm afraid I'm not feeling hugely confident about it myself. But it gives a sense of a fact that actually, in this case, there is a reasonably high level of optimism we will reach the target, which I think is surprising. But again, significant number of naysayers. So we have this issue here that we have chunks, these often embedded chunks of people who are still not actively engaged in climate change. They're not actively supporting climate action. Sometimes they're actively resisting, and they have to be reached. Now, this does not mean the tiny, tiny number of hardcore dedicated climate deniers. We don't need to talk with them. They will either come over or not according to their own thing. What I'm talking here about is a significant number of people who are not that worried about it.
I'll take also this opportunity to tell you a bit more about SCAN, so who put up this event together. So we're the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network, and we're a network of different community groups and individuals all across Scotland working to tackle climate change in different ways. And yes, we have got a membership as a network, which is free for both individuals and organization, which gives you access to a lot of the events we're doing, as well as some kind of peer-to-peer networking opportunities, and we're in the process of setting up regional networks in 10 different regions. So there'll be again some opportunities to network and get people involved in so many different ways to take climate action. The link in the chat for our membership, if you are not yet a member of SCAN but would like to become.
In answer to a few of the questions I picked up, Betton, you put up actually a really nice thing there as a quote from your local WhatsApp group about how people respond to children. All I can say is yes, that's exactly right. This whole thing of children as communicators is something which triggers people as well. So like, don't necessarily think about putting children in the front line to say, you know, I care about my future, because some people think that they've been indoctrinated. And in a way they have. I mean, they've picked up the concerns that we wish to share. We haven't indoctrinated them, they've picked it up. And if you don't like that, there's a whole lot of issues regarding children and the use of children, just to warn it's a minefield. Tony, you asked a question about, like, you know, do we encounter people who don't think that they're effective as communicators, and what do we say to them? And yes, we do all the time. And I guess it's hard. I mean, sometimes it's a confidence issue. But the one thing I know is that actually, and I always say to people, is I actually say, look, the people who are not great communicators are often the very best communicators. If you can overcome your nerves, and that you feel that you can go out there, the point is that you can connect with people in a way because you are authentic. In other words, somebody who just seems completely confident and fluent and has no scare, has no sense of fear of being in front of people talking, is often less persuasive as a communicator, because it just looks like they're playing a game. They're like an actor. They can do it. It's easy for them. They look like a politician. That's one reason people hate politicians, is they just feel like they're just playing a game. And when we do speaker training, or I do communications training, I always encourage people, if they're nervous, to play to that as a strength. In other words, if they were giving a speech somewhere, to say, and they weren't that good, to say, look, you can see I'm not comfortable doing public speaking. I'm really nervous. I slept badly last night. I don't like doing this. And I'm doing it because I really care about it, and it's important. And that's a challenge for me. In other words, to show that the challenge is an expression of your commitment to the issue is very powerful. And then if you've given a really haltering speech, the sympathy of the audience is totally with you, because they can see you've tried to do something hard. And I'd say that, don't look up. Someone asked about that. Yes, please, let's ask about that. I was one of the advisors to Netflix on that, so I'd very much like to talk to you about it. And yeah, Rabana raised sorry, I hope I said your name right, raised an interesting question about visioning net zero. And I agree, I'm not saying much in this about positive visions for the future. But I think it's important. I think we need to be saying as part of our narrative where we're going is a place which is worthwhile. But remember, seen through the lens of people's actual concerns and values. So do not present a vision of net zero that is not the vision that those people might like for the future. It has to be whatever their concerns are. I'll come back to that point later, if I may. Right. Let's talk about audiences, about who you're speaking to. I'm going to ask you in a moment to go back into breakout groups to consider this. Climate Outreach has done a large piece of ongoing work, which included research in Scotland, although I haven't for this presentation been able to pull out the specific Scottish data, other than to say that it parallels with UK data, so we can draw broad conclusions. Dividing the country up into 7 audiences of specific values-based segments. It was a large survey. I mean, in the original survey, I think it was over 3,000 people. There was many focus groups. It's an ongoing program, so we're going to keep building on this, renewing it, and restoring it. Have a look on our website, and you can download all of the materials on it. And these are the segments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these, and then I'm going to put you into breakout groups to discuss which of these you think of your audiences who are your priority audiences for reaching and who you're working with. Segmentation is it's always an intellectual game, in the sense that, you know, dividing people up is tricky, and nobody can readily be divided into a category. A lot of people intuitively hate it anyway, this idea of being like, you know, analyzed in this way. And there's a lot of crossover people. There's a lot of people who are in more than one category. I mean, I look at that and I consider myself to be in about 4 of them. That being said, it's a useful tool because it helps you to ask, who am I speaking to? And am I speaking to them the right way? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these 7 segments. Whilst I'm doing that, please, I'd like you to be thinking which of the ones you work with and which of the main ones you need or want to reach. Now, these are all slightly different things. You may very well want to reach people who are not the people you normally work with. And I think that's important, and we need to really encourage that. But there may be segments you need to reach, but you don't particularly want to reach and you're not working with. And I keep coming back to that point. There are audiences out there who are consistently ignored and underengaged because they do not sit within the constituencies of environmental or climate change groups. And sometimes they're not people that anybody wants to speak to. But somebody has to do that because we need a mandate and because they're people and they have a contribution to make. So have a look at this, and after I show you this, you'll go into breakout rooms to discuss the ones you work with, the ones you need to reach, and the ones you want to reach. Okay, I'm going to go through these quite quickly. So quickly have a scan of the text on the screen. Progressive activists, okay, easy. They're the ones who, if you were to put up a poster in town saying, we're holding a climate change event, they're the ones who are going to turn up. Young, generally younger, though, there's plenty of older people in there. Younger, opinionated, progressive, mostly left-wing, large left-wing. When I say most left-wing, it's like compared to the other segments, and strong supporters of Remain, exactly who you would expect in that group. Alongside them, also left-leaning, progressive, is a group we call Civic Pragmatists. They're involved in a much wider range of issues. They're much more invested in community, local charity. Yeah. So Civic Pragmatists, we'd say, are like the activists, but they're more concerned with social justice issues, inequality and racism. So they're a group that have broader based concerns. Right. Third one. Disengaged battlers. As the word disengaged suggests, they don't feel involved by the political system. They feel ignored and pushed out. We're looking here at the more left-wing orientated groups. So these people are left-wing in their politics. They're very strongly motivated by issues of social justice. They just feel that the world isn't fair, that no one's listening to them, that they feel they're not a part of a community, that they're feeling cut out from things. They're like younger people. They're seeing limited opportunities, and they're disengaged from a wider range of views. Now let's have a little look at the ones who are on the more conservative side. Well, backbone conservatives. This is probably the one group which is less strong in Scotland than we might find in other parts of the UK. They're very patriotic. They like authority. They have a strong sense of authority, respect for authority. You can imagine respect for institutions, for social elites. They tend to be older, well off, better educated. Have you got that? Now, alongside them is a group which are they're conservative in their orientation. They're more socially liberal than the hardcore conservatives. They are, of all of the groups, the ones which actually think we have less to be worried about. They're very oriented towards business. Moving forward, they have a very positive outlook on life. They think things are doing pretty well. See, the backbone conservatives often think that things constantly think that things are getting worse, but people are getting disrespectful, that society is falling apart. Whereas these people actually think that things are going pretty well. But they're globally outlook, so they strongly lent towards Remain on a business argument, for example. Then we have another disengaged group here on the right, Disengage Traditionalists. These are groups who are working class conservatives. They are the absolute core of the Red Wall constituencies which shifted over from Labour voting to Conservative voting and were actually the reason that we currently have a Conservative government in Westminster. I mean, they swung it. Male, often older, working class, less well educated, and they don't think that anybody listens to them. They feel excluded and they're pissed off about it. But unlike the disengaged battlers, they hold on much less to an argument about being hard done by. So the disengaged battlers actually feel that they feel really kind of like they want to bring down the rich, and they want to they think that they feel victimized. The traditionalists actually are very proud of their work. They work hard. They hate benefit scroungers. I mean, this is an audience where this is absolutely the people who would be, spit blood at the thought of somebody on disability benefit trampolining in their garden. It's no coincidence, by the way, but you see a little corner of the sun there in the logo for them. This is very much the heartland of disengaged traditionalists, right? And then we have this group, Loyal Nationals. This is a very interesting group. Often working class, conservative in their orientation, although conservative socially, but also more left-wing politically. And the reason it's a significant group and different from the others is it is not disengaged. It's very politically engaged. They're very interested in politics. They vote, they mobilize. And the big issue that they mobilize about or that they care about is immigration. And for that reason, this is a group which has been very, very largely bypassed by environmental organizations. They don't like big business. They like the redistribution of wealth. They're complex, but they're active. These were the people who absolutely led the campaign for Brexit at a grassroots level. And they're a significant group. Okay. Now, again, you might go, well, in Scotland, we didn't have so much support for Brexit. Well, no, but you have plenty of loyal nationals. I'd imagine probably in Scotland, the loyal nationals are probably strongly on the independent side. They are nonetheless a demographic group of people with a strong value set. And if you look at the other values, I'm sure you'll recognize them. So I'd like you please to go into a breakout now and for 5 minutes, have a conversation about the audiences you work with, movies you work with, and who you'd like to reach. Can we press the button? Again, sadly, because of the numbers on here, I can't hear back from you about who you are working with. I very much hope, though, that you're considering as part of that the audiences who you might not otherwise reach. Generally speaking, the ones who need more work are going to be those ones in the disengaged group, the ones on the right of a political spectrum. And don't forget backbone conservatives. Often they are under engaged, and they're important. Everybody's important, right? We need to make sure we're reaching right across the diversity of society. Let me unpack this a little bit. The first finding, which is important from the research, is that everybody is concerned about climate change. You'll notice here, though, that that's the black bar for very concerned. You'll notice that progressive activists are off a scale higher. Of course they are. It's part of their core identity. In a way, there's a kind of a tautology there. It's like progressive activists are very concerned about, have an identity that is very concerned about climate change because they have an identity that is very concerned about climate change. It's self-fulfilling. And part of it, other people would be more engaged if they saw themselves as being climate change people. But when you look at that, there's something very curious as well. When you look at those black bars, for although they diminish as you move to the right, loyal nationals are very high indeed. And they are almost as high indeed as this much more left-leaning civic pragmatists. And one of the key findings of a Britain Talks climate work was that loyal nationals were an underdeveloped audience. I've got the same problem again, I'm afraid, which is that I wonder if I can, sorry, I've got things on my screen, and when they're on my screen, I can't see what I'm looking at. As I also said, reflecting on the Scottish the Scottish research, all groups except we're facing impacts now. And again, that's very interesting. That's a very significant shift over where we were before. What's actually, in a way, even more interesting is that whereas, and this was definitely a surprise to me, but whereas we have always seen climate change as being sometimes a politically polarized issue, and the right-wing newspapers, especially the Daily Mail and Express, have led on climate denial, I actually see that in reality, when we ask people, they think climate change concerns all of us, regardless of politics. And I think that's a very positive sign, that climate change is now being seen as a thing with much wider spread. I would love to see how these questions panned out in the US. Can I also say, by the way, that this has been a shift over time. I think it's a measure of the success of all of us, including all of you who are working in the climate change community, of reaching wider and creating a social mandate and a broader social concern about climate change, that people now see it in these much more generic terms. So I'm going to unpick quickly for you some of the research findings about how best to speak to these different audiences, but I strongly recommend you have a look at the report. Progressive activists, fine. You know what? We know how to talk to them because that's actually what many of us on the call will be, and they're easy. You have to avoid the fatalism, though. There's a strong tendency for this group to get into a very depressed and aggressive state, and I think the big challenge of progressive activists is to persuade them, as I've been saying in this, that we need to reach everybody. And that means that they must actively reach out and engage people, not actively alienate people. By the way, the silver lining of COVID messages is to say, was the kind of messaging we've seen of saying, hey, the good thing about COVID was that people flew less. Don't say there's no good messages about COVID and shouldn't be promoted that way. Civic pragmatists, well, they need to be encouraged and supported, but their voice is important. The key things for them is bringing people together. So unlike the activists, who actually can be quite divisive, the pragmatists like message which is about how we can all come together, we can all pull together, we can all take action together, that climate change is an issue that can unite us. So that's a key message for this group. And we need to make the interconnections with other issues. Whatever they are, they will have different issues, but generally speaking, these issues of diversity, social rights, social justice are strong motivators for them. The battlers are hard. There's no question about that. They're fatalistic, they're disempowered, and therefore, and the last thing they need is another bloody problem. They're strongly of a view that the world is extremely unfair. You can see here, for example, here's the difference between battlers and traditionalists in terms of their attitudes, that there's one law for the rich and one for the poor. There's an enormous difference between them. Yeah. They really feel that they're badly done by. And really for them, it's about finding the connection with the issues they care about, as with everybody, but especially with them. Yeah. So jobs are going to be very important to them, but they need tangible jobs. I've got to make this point, and I'm going to feed in this point about how do we present a vision of net zero. People have to see the jobs. We cannot say in the low carbon future there will be 100,000 new jobs, because people will say, don't believe it. That's political talk. That's what politicians say. Just big promises. They have to see it. Stuff has to be visible and tangible. They have to either see it or feel it, do it themselves, or know someone who does. And lifestyle is deadly. Like this kind of thing about middle class lifestyles, about saying, hey, in the low carbon future, you can have an electric car, is disastrous communications for people who feel that they're really struggling to have a car at all. So these people are badly affected by what I think are positive climate communications based on privilege. And there's a lot of that out there. And they need a message which is much more about, no, down to earth, straightforward talking. Also, of course, from people they trust. Backbone communicators. Well, backbone communicators, one of the interesting things about them is that they don't mind taking personal action. They're the kind of people who do insulate their homes and probably do it very well. They might install a heat pump. You know, they might get an electric car. They like doing things. They don't like waste. They hate waste. Waste is, by the way, waste is one of those messages and campaign issues that can cross boundaries very effectively. Food waste completely. There's two things I never understand why they're not a stronger profile on climate campaigning. Food waste and idling your vehicle. These are both wasteful, they're unnecessary, they cost money, people can see that they're wrong, and no one disagrees that they shouldn't be done. And so these are low-hanging fruit, but what's more, they're actually quite major impacts too. I mean, food waste especially is a huge impact. So these are things that we can run on, and backbone conservatives will strongly support that. So as it says here, like, go for the things they care about. Farming, British way of life. Have Britain as a leader. We need to be careful of that, because Britain isn't that much of a leader. We need messaging which is not left-wing messaging. So in other words, issues that left-wing progressives will deeply care about are absolute turn-offs for this group. And I think we need to be careful, if we want to reach wider, that we don't get drawn into having climate messaging which is too intersectional when talking to this group. We can talk to them about climate change. If we try and bring in wider issues, they will immediately switch off, and they need messengers. Established liberals, right, this is a group to which you can talk about electric vehicles and low carbon technologies and all of that. They love that stuff. In fact, because they're rich, because they're affluent, they like technologies, all of the language for them is business opportunities. They like big businesses, low carbon industries, investing in the future. They're utterly behind it. That's why they strongly support climate action. They think it's a good investment. So tell the positive story, you know, all of it. There's a lot of positive stuff. I mean, there's a lot of positive technology stories, right? And that's the one for them. Another disengaged group, tricky, very tricky, because they're disempowered, often thoroughly cheesed off group. They don't like victim language. They're proud of who they are. But they do like things which are proud of building on our proud industrial past. I'm going to come back to this point in a bit, because there's a whole lot of messaging around this. Yeah, talk about opportunities, build trust. And finally, loyal nationals, this really important group here. I think we need some loyal nationals to speak to loyal nationals. They are concerned. Climate impacts are big for them. Things like flooding is a big issue for them, and that it really registers with them. So that's the kind of thing to talk about, right? Talk out big polluters. They hate oil and gas companies. They hate profiteering. These are all the kind of things that we can, as I was saying before, we could talk about transition within these wider issues of who do you trust. We've got to be careful because immigration is one of the big motivating issues for them. And I have no doubt looking forward at some point that there will be right-wing populists who support climate action using the argument of immigration, saying we will be flooded, that ugly word, with climate migrants, which, by the way, there's no evidence for. There's no evidence we would be, but using that motivation because they realize that's the way to reach this group. We've got to be careful with that. We don't want to go down that line. That's not a pleasant or helpful place to be. But we can nonetheless speak to them about these wider issues. Right. I hope that was useful. As you said, there's a lot on in our reports, and if you stay on after past, I'll be happy to answer questions. I'm now going to quickly go through some general things about how do we speak outside the green choir. The first thing to say is climate outreach has really, I think, been a world leader in some ways of doing the research on the centre-right. It's just a fraction of the research work we've done. How do we speak to people's centre-right values? Now, the important thing to stress on that is people's centre-right values don't necessarily vote Conservative. People's centre-right values, well, by some reckonings, the majority of people in Britain have centre-right values. It's one of the largest groups, that's for sure. And so, and by the way, if we're talking about crossing over into new audiences, immigrants, people from traditional societies, particularly people with a Muslim background, very often have centre-right values and very rarely vote Conservative as a percentage, right? So we need to recognize and respect those values as something which is a really important part of our society. How do we work with it? Well, one way is that we can try and talk about wider issues than just environment and energy. Those things are important. But here's a list of the other things, right? Health, I'll talk about in a moment, and security, jobs, all of these things are important. Heritage, landscape, fairness, independence. Independence is an issue, which, as we know, is a big trigger in Scotland. The primary, when I did some work in Eastern Europe, this was some years ago, and it was clear to me that the absolute driving argument for rapid transition to renewables was energy independence from Russian gas. And I'm really surprised that hasn't been a bigger, stronger argument all along. Now it's on the table. Great. But it should have been there all along. Independence, energy independence is a huge issue, right? I might say also, energy poverty fuel poverty is a huge issue if you're that way inclined, which incidentally means that you're probably more on the progressive left side. Fairness. Really important. Is something fair? Is it not fair? Climate change is fundamentally unfair. Caring about landscape, our countryside, these are more conservative values which people get very motivated by. I mean, here, and this was my community in Wales. I'm not now living in Wales, but for many years I did in mid-Wales. There was a massive rebellion against wind farms. We in mid-Wales love our land. The campaign against wind farms was a defense of nature and landscape values. And these weren't NIMBYs. This was one of the most powerful local grassroots community campaigns I've ever seen. And it was because the Welsh government had done a completely awful job of engaging people. They just assumed they could just draw lines on a map and say, great, we'll have wind farms there and we'll put in the grid connector there, without bringing people along with them. And this is what happens. This is what happens. They saw it as an imposition on them and their landscape. So we need to respect those values. Health is powerful. As I've already flagged up, doctors and health professionals are trusted communicators. They are important, right? So people will trust them. But also health is one of those issues which crosses over. Forest fires, less of an issue here, but there's definitely major health impacts from flooding and all the rest of it. Air pollution. So the big argument for transition towards electric vehicles is air pollution in cities, which is a very motivating issue. As you can see here on the left, there's a whole report. I don't think it's on our website, but I'm happy to share if anybody wants it, on how people center-right values feel and respond to air quality issues. And it's powerful for them. They want children to play outside, which is interesting. Like the big mobilizing thing is again, the sense that things are not how they should be. People should be outside. Children shouldn't be on their screens. They should be outside. Clean transport, clean air for cities. I mean, improved diet as well. But we've got to be careful with diet, right? Telling people not to eat meat is an interesting one because it immediately triggers people's "don't tell me what to do" because you're up against their identity. So diet is one of those things where it has to come from internally within their peer group. But the idea that actually you can have a more healthy diet, that's okay. That seems like a safe place to go. You know, you might like to cycle to work instead of taking the car. Why? For your health. Oh, and the climate's good as well, but good for your health. You see what I mean? So health is powerful. COVID has been very interesting because here you can see on our segments, COVID has significantly shifted people's sense of togetherness. And I think that creates new opportunities for building on the back of COVID. Maybe directly, maybe saying, look, it was really hard, but we pulled together. And this is, you know, let's community's kindness as the poster. I think that might even be Scotland by the look of it. And you'll see the shift. This was February 20, I have to remember, it's been going so long now, I can't even remember. February 21 and May 21. Have I got that right? And it's the shift from just before COVID until COVID was really kicking in. So I can't remember how many years it's been going for now. So you can see, but anyway, just before COVID and just after, and you can see the shift in people thinking we look after each other, and it's everyone for themselves. Across all of the groups, a massive swing from the majority of people, large majorities thinking in our society, everyone looks after themselves, do we look after each other? I think that's a real opportunity. That leads me on to the next point, which is this one here, which is one of care. We need to talk about care. You know, we can, rather than that appalling, those appalling negative things where we say climate change is going to destroy us. We're, you know, with like the Scottish advert I showed and all the other adverts, a much better way of doing it would be to say we've had flooding and we've cared for each other. Because in Scotland, we look after each other. We support our communities. Acts of loving kindness. We're going to be having more of that. As climate change shows, we're going to be having bigger impacts coming down the way. We can stand up to it and pull together because that's what we do in Scotland. Images of care, of love. These are powerful ways of speaking and very much underestimated. It does not mean you cannot talk about how serious climate change is, but you do it within the context of something which is positive and validating. In this case, it starts with validation. You ground the messaging in previous examples of people caring for each other, then build into that the warning of a scientist saying we've got more problems coming down the line, and then you reinforce that sense of local value. This is the basis, by the way, under which you can have a conversation in any community, and people I know have done this very effectively in places like Florida and Texas, which starts from preparation and caring rather than heavy climate science. It all gets played out, but you do it in the right way. By the way, this and other recommendations in a report that we wrote for Adaptation Scotland, communicating climate change adaptation and how best to do it. So, by the way, don't like the word adaptation, preparation, much better. Adaptation suggests that, well, we can just do a few things and then we'll be okay. It's like, no, we need to prepare for it. It's going to be hard, but we can prepare for it. It's a different way of thinking. Again, the link is there. I'd recommend that. Plowing ahead. when we're talking with people more conservative values, this is a little aside, but I think an interesting one. Words beginning with "re" seem very powerful. Here's a few of them, you know, and I think the success of that with more kind of like centre-right, conservative-minded people is that it's about doing something again. So they strongly believe that that they strongly support existing ways of doing things, traditions, the sense that the institutions we have are precious and need to be protected. And they like the idea of that's another reword, reinforcing what is already there. So for this audience, by the way, this is like a quote, for example, from the then Canadian Premier, who is his name going to come up if I press the button there? Yeah, Stephen Harper. Just loaded with rewords. I mean, politicians use rewords all the time, and there's a reason for that, because they work with this audience. Well, the nice thing about rewords is they don't antagonize the other audience. That's what makes them so sweet. So they work well across audiences. Oh, here's Scottish Conservatives Manifesto, Rebuild Scotland. I mean, there's a lot of this. Now, again, I'd repeat to any of you on the call who are, I hope there's people on the call who are conservatives. Great. I want you to be a part of this conversation. And there may be people on this call who hate conservatives. Well, sorry, conservatives have to be part of a conversation. They're an important part of the conversation. And therefore, we need to think best how to speak to them. By the way, I've been very impressed in Australia by how the thinking there has all the way down this line, how to reach out to these audiences. Queensland, what a headache. Queensland's a major challenge in Australia. Here's the Australian Conservation Foundation doing messaging in Queensland. And amongst their communicators, the fellow up the bloke the bloke up the top who's installing solar, and the woman at the bottom who's a lifeguard. I mean, what could be more iconic and Aussie than a lifeguard, right? And language, recover our economy, rebuild, renew. Okay, this is the ballpark for where things work well. This incidentally was a campaign we ran for with an organization called Tier Fund with conservative evangelicals. Renew our world, restore the land. I'm just flagging up for you that sometimes individual words operate as frames where people say, yes, that's my kind of word. This is an example, but there are others. And the way you find them is by sitting down and listening carefully and asking questions and listening carefully to people from that audience and looking at the words they use. And that's why one of the things we do in climate outreach, for example, when we do a focus group, is we transcribe that. We ask people to describe themselves, what makes them proud, what's important to them. And then we carefully go through the transcription. We look at the words they're using. By the way, they use rewords a lot. Balance is another word which comes through again and again and again. And we know that that's the place where when we use that word, they'll go, yeah, that's me there talk to, which is the basis of good communications. Let's talk a little bit about national narratives, and then I'm going to give you a couple of minutes in your groups again. National narratives are important because if we're speaking in a community, we can say, here in name of your community, we love our community, let's pull together, this is what's important to us. You've got something in common, right? Or if you're talking a workplace, people work for the same thing, or a trades union, or a church, or whatever. But if we're talking across a society, we need to find a way of bringing people together around a sense of shared values and shared identity, right? So, can we do that? And the answer is, well, yes, in many places we can. Some places have a weak sense of national identity, and it's not the best way of doing it. Some places it's very divided. I've been working in Belgium, for example. Belgium is challenging because there's quite a lot of division internally between the two main language groups in terms of belonging to Belgium as a kind of a strange country for that, right? But Scotland, crikey, you have a very powerful sense of Scottish identity. Now, I'm not denying the fact there may very well be schisms there people who feel that they're not included, not part. I'm just saying there is a very strong Scottish identity, and we know that. as there is in Wales. We did the first major program we did, a government advisory program with the Welsh government, developing an entire toolkit for how to talk about climate change and sustainable development in Wales. And one of the things we found was a Welsh word, bodlondeb, which for the contentedness you find in your family, in your community. It's a non-translatable word. It's a kind of Welsh word. And we tried hard. We didn't win it, but we tried hard to see if we could get the government to even just drop sustainable development and only talk about bodlondeb. In other words, can we find something so specific to a culture that that can become the main operating frame for communications? I guess that's the kind of challenge I give to you in Scotland. And it might be that locally you could do that. It might be if you were working in Glasgow that there would be a word in Glaswegian slang that was just so nice and so strong, you go, great, that's the one we'll use. Because the more we can use things which speak to people, the better. We tested the existing language used by the Scottish government. And this is part of the reason why I'm saying we've got to be very careful, especially with these more disengaged groups about the language. Because talking about the exciting low carbon technologies and thousands of new jobs, they hated it. It doesn't work. It sounds inauthentic. As I said, delusional nonsense, can't afford it. And so the way that most people speak fails. I think it's always very good to test that. But what was important in Wales, and this is going to be an important issue in Scotland as well, was that simply saying fossil fuel industry is filthy and dirty and disgusting was actually quite destructive. People moved away from that. They hated it. Although Wales doesn't produce coal anymore, I imagine it's the same in Scotland. I don't expect you have a coal industry anymore. Forgive me if I'm wrong. But it was nonetheless a part of national pride. It was something which people felt were identifications, especially the kind of communications, let's face it, largely by middle-class urban environmentalists saying the coal industry is filthy, just really got people's backs up. So this language was language which we developed there and which tested very well, was of talking about how renewables were part of a national story, about how moving to renewables had come out from a resource-rich country. By the way, this is language which we're finding works well in Australia too, and I think would probably work well in Scotland. In other words, language which validates and respects the national, particularly the working class experience of being in heavy industry and resource extraction as a basis of national pride rather than something to be dismissed, is, I think, a powerful place to look for national narratives. So we've done national narratives work in India, this is up on the website, across North Africa, and in Alberta. And I'll just say a couple of words about Alberta, because like Scotland, Alberta has an oil industry, but I think unlike Scotland, it's massive. I mean, when we were doing, over 500 people went through our focus groups there. We worked with over 70 partners in Alberta. It's a big project. And within that, we couldn't recall a single person in those groups who didn't themselves work for the oil industry or have friends or family in the oil industry. I mean, it's enormous. And that's why the threat for them of climate change isn't so much even about the impacts of climate change, but the threat that believing in it or accepting it could destroy their jobs. So you're dealing with a very different situation. And there will certainly be groups within who are dependent on oil and the oil industry in Scotland who will feel similarly. So how do we talk about it? Well, starting, I think, from a position of gratitude. That's what we found again in Alberta. Thank you. We're grateful for your work of building the prosperity of our province, of Scotland, of our country. It's really bloody hard work, hard and dangerous, and thank you. But the dependency is a problem. It's made us insecure. We're too dependent. And we've got a problem, which is climate change, which is a real challenge for us. So we need to move forward, create a balance. It's that balance word I already said is powerful. And this will not be easy. I want to go back onto this point. So it's that model I said, validation, reflect people's values, reflect their concerns, which are about security and dependency, and say, we're going to take action on that because that's who we are. And this is part of that. This will not be easy. Can I just say, in every one of these examples, including India and North Africa, we test this language about pairing easy messaging against hard messaging. People prefer hard messaging. They prefer to be told this is going to be really hard, but we can do it, rather than this is going to be hard and it's going to wipe us out. Validate people's identity. We have faced other challenges. We'll face this one head on. We'll pull together. We've done other difficult things before. This will be tough, but we can see it through. We know this messaging works. And on the back of this, again, a validation message, you can start to come in with some seriously hard-hitting information about how bad climate change is going to be, right? And the transition is going to be hard. It's going to be hard. I don't think we haven't got enough conversation yet about how bloody hard this is going to be, right? So it's going to be hard, but we can do it. So I'd like you quickly in your breakout groups, just for 3 minutes, if we could. Just, yeah, I'm asking you for 3 words, but you know what? You can just ignore that. I'm kind of interested in you just to ideas about where you think we could find, or you could find the way of speaking across Scotland around shared values and a national Scottish climate narrative, which will be different from an English or Welsh or American or an Indian narrative. Obviously, it's got to be totally Scottish. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of this work. Different countries have different cultures have different things which have shared values, and I'm sure that in Scotland there's some very strong shared values. But really, I mean, the point of this exercise is to try and think: are there ways that we can talk across societies in a way that bring people together? And the answer is most definitely there are. And I suspect in Scotland it's probably stronger than most countries. I want to say just a few words before I close, and we're now up to time, so if anybody needs to drop out, I am sorry, but there will be a recording, of course, to share. There was some interest in personal issues, personal and building issues. I'm going to quickly touch those. Personal behaviors. Just a few general thoughts. Skip this slide here. We have to be very careful with when we ask people for behaviors, but people don't that people don't do a kind of a moral, what's called moral licensing, where they say, well, I do this good thing here, so it makes me feel okay about doing this bad thing here. It's called negative spillover in a technical term. That's to say that people do an environmental behavior and they use it to justify a more destructive one. This was a notorious one where Tesco ran a campaign saying that if you bought low energy light bulbs, they'd give you air miles. But there's a lot of that goes around. And we need to be very careful of behaviors that if we just say do this thing or do this or don't do this thing, but people take a low hanging fruit, like a very simple thing, and then actually just use it to justify something more destructive. Ultimately, the only solution on behaviors is for people to really engage, I think, with climate change and to make their personal response to that a core part of their values, of saying, I'm concerned about this and therefore I don't do these things. And that's hard. I'm not saying it's not hard, but as I said, there's low-hanging fruit around waste, for example. We need to be very careful of this kind of thing. There's for a long time, advocates were giving people easy things to do, like here's 10 easy things you can do to save the planet. And there was a lot of this about 20 years ago, and it's all coming back now. And we have to be very careful that we only talk about behaviors which are really impactful. This thing, for example, about unplugging mobile phone chargers is an absolute red herring. And I don't know where this statistic comes from, but it's just rubbish. They use virtually no power. This is not a relevant way for people to save energy. So we have to keep the focus on things which are important. We also have to be careful that not always to do our messaging around saving money. I think this is another mistake, and this is repeatedly done with communications around home insulation. Now, there's going to be a lot of that right now, and money is definitely a major motivator. And I think maybe at the moment, money is a stronger message. But generally speaking, the reason that people will invest in insulation in the home is to make it more of a home. In other words, the values, it goes back to that point of validating and reinforcing values. The value of the home is, I love this place, it's where I express myself, it's my sanctuary, it's the place where I raise my family. I'm therefore going to invest in it because I love it, and I'm going to make it more homely. I'm going to make it more comfortable. I'm going to make it fresher, brighter, more modern, cleaner, healthier, all of those things. And by the way, when I do that, I'll save some money that can even pay for all of the developments I'm making. And that's always going to be the place to go. Now, right now, there will be major motivations about saving money, but the thing is that the people who are most money pressed are very often the people who are living in rented accommodation or do not have the spare money to invest in their property. So we need to be careful with this messaging, and we need to speak to those other values. And as MasterCard have done with their campaigns for years and years, they would show people spending a bit of money on something, but then the satisfaction being what they called priceless. And I think that's the point. The point is that it's those other benefits which are important. On this wider, huge issue of building renovation, we've done quite a lot of work on it. We advised Renovate Europe, which is a big European campaign, to stop talking about money and stop talking this very technical way and talk about family homes, investing in these kind of core values, which has been very successful for them. So quickly flag up some of the ways we can talk about buildings and building renovation. Infrastructure. We really need to flag up infrastructure. Like, buildings are infrastructure. And I think in Britain, if they had been defined as such, it would have really changed the way that government spent money on. Positive future, better jobs. Yes, we know that. We know we need to talk about not just jobs, but better jobs, good, sustainable, long-term jobs. It's not just when we talk about the quality of low carbon jobs, it's not about low carbon jobs. It isn't just quantity, it's about quality. It's about, these are going to be really good jobs. They're going to be skilled jobs, sustainable, worthwhile, satisfying jobs. Yeah. Growth. Okay, I'm going to flip through these very quickly. A better life. It's like, yeah, we want a better life. So these are the messages about home insulation. Better home, clean, fresh, healthy, comfortable, modern, cozy, great for families, and even better, you can save some money on it. Renovation is renewal. This is a message for conservatives. It's these rewords. It's like, let's renovate the whole country and renew it. And crikey, that's the messaging we need. Like, we need to be talking about rebuilding, renewing, renovating the entire building stock of our countries. And great, by the way, for jobs. This incidentally was a program we ran in Wales. We designed this, encouraging older people to do renovation and renewable energy technologies in their homes. And the messaging, as you see, isn't about money. It's about coziness, and it's reflecting the value that for old people, the most important thing for them about their home was that it gave them independence and identity. This messaging emerged from sitting and talking and listening to people describe their homes. It goes back to this idea that messaging starts by asking people about their values and their identity, and works from there. So we're not saying, hey, fix up your home and save climate change, or hey, fix up your home and save money. We're saying, hey, fix up your home and make it more your home. That's the trick. Right, last thoughts. I just thought we can stop at this point and go into questions and answers. And I just thought I'd show another Scottish government advert, and we'd have a little look at that, and we'd stop with that, and then very interested to hear your views on this, and we can go into Q&As. How about that? So now mobilize everything we've talked about now. What do we think? What works? What doesn't work? Is this good? Is this not good? Then this was another advert put out by the Scottish government, so it's kind of topical to think, well, now if we had been sitting and we'd been thinking about this advert, how might this now be done differently on the basis of a conversation that we've been having, or admittedly I've been monologuing for the past 2.5 hours.
We're living in a global climate emergency. So Scotland has committed to reduce emissions to reach net zero by 2045 and earlier than many. We'll get there in a way that's equal, fair, and creates new opportunities. We've written that into law. And we're guaranteeing a job, education, or training to everyone aged 16 to 24. We're protecting peatlands and creating new woodlands to make the most of our natural carbon capture potential. In 2 years, we've planted 22,000 hectares of trees, an area nearly 4 times the size of Loch Ness. And we're investing in sustainable economic growth. In 2020, the equivalent of over 95% of the electricity we used came from renewables. Our floating wind farm is the world's first. As we recover from the pandemic, we strive to make Scotland fairer and greener. And with the UN Climate Summit COP26 this November in our city of Glasgow, we'll play our part to achieve lasting action that gets us all to net zero.
So I'm going to stop there, and very interested to have questions answered.